50% in taxes.
Everyone I meet here is complaining.
What the hell's going on with those prices?
Now everyone in London can't afford bread.
Salaries aren't matching, and London's quite an expensive city to live in.
While many countries deal with inflation, here in the UK, it's been called a cost of living crisis.
Food prices, public transport.
Everything's gone up, fuel prices, house prices insanely high.
The UK economy is the only major economy expected to actually shrink this year.
And UK's economy was just surpassed by India.
Why do we have a cost of living crisis? Because we doubled the money supply in like 2 years.
I don't know how people are even doing it.
Everyone I speak to here blames the government.
Brexit, coronavirus, Ukraine, government.
They're a government in panic mode.
How do they expect us to continue? I have a small business.
Last year, the UK had 3 separate prime ministers. This caused political chaos.
I don't think any government has the willpower to actually make real change.
Many here trace the root cause to a decision made in 2016.
Because of Brexit.
Brexit's to blame. The pound decreasing in value and never really recovering.
But how much is Brexit really to blame for all of this?
I mean, you can't vote out of the biggest trading bloc in the world and expect to have a growing economy.
Some are leaving London. Others are leaving the UK altogether.
A lot of people are actually leaving the UK.
If we pay our taxes, they should come back to benefit us in some way, shape or form.
UK might be losing its competitive edge. A lot of people have left to Portugal, to Spain, where it's nice and sunny, better than in the UK, and flats are cheaper over there too.
Can it get worse? I hope not.
Overall inflation stubbornly high.
Cost of living crisis.
The cost of living in the UK is rising, and it's changing people's lives.
The UK has fallen into its largest recession on record.
So is the UK actually collapsing? And if so, why?
The complaints start with housing.
Home prices here have risen a lot in recent years.
Everyone I speak to talks about the rising cost of rent. The average rent in London reached £2,500 per month. That's about $3,150.
Middle class workers really can't keep up with the rental prices going up.
Rent is absolutely crazy. Once upon a time, you could get a room for like, let's call it £400 to £600. And it was a decent sized room. You had space for everything. Now, so you could possibly have stuff in storage and pay for storage, as well as renting a room, which is literally about the size of me putting my hands out like this.
Many in London have moved to cheaper cities.
A lot of my friends who have to work in the UK, they have left London. Most of my friends, they've gone up north, they've gone up to Manchester. Let's say if you can rent an amazing flat in Birmingham and Manchester for £1,000, £1,200 a month.
But that presents its own problems too.
Then I don't think Manchester as a city can actually handle it. It doesn't have the infrastructure in the system that London does, and it is struggling a lot.
Home prices are now set to fall. This as the Bank of England's increase in borrowing costs will ultimately make mortgages less desirable. Wages in the UK are not keeping up with prices.
The salaries and the pay rises are not going up that quick with the prices. The companies can't keep up.
The IMF predicts that while other major economies are growing, the UK's economy will shrink, and the Bank of England expects a recession.
But how did the UK get here?
And why is the UK doing worse than the US or Germany or France? Well, there are many reasons. For one, its economy took a bigger hit during the pandemic.
They wanted to print infinite money. Everybody wanted to not work during Corona times, which makes sense to a degree. But then they were like, all right, let's just double the money supply so we can pay. The solution in most people's mind seems to be let's print more money that we can pay them. So basically, it's just a never-ending cycle and everybody's kind of screwed.
The annual rate of inflation hit 11.1% last October. That was a 41-year high. It's since gone down a bit.
Most of it increased. Food, groceries definitely increased like at least 15-20%. If at the beginning it was saying that the price is going up like 10%, now you can see the differences in like 2 last year, so 20%.
Meanwhile, the UK is facing challenges with soaring energy costs as it relies heavily on gas-generated electricity, much of that as a result of the war in Ukraine.
Electricity and gas bills, they're probably the first immediate thing that I notice.
But in order to understand this story, we have to go back to 2016.
Brexit stands for British exit. When the UK decided to leave the European Union. Think of it like a divorce. In 2016, citizens voted to leave, but by a very slim margin. So the UK went on this crazy journey to leave the EU, and that impacted trade, immigration, and regulations. And on January 31st, 2020, it officially happened.
It's definitely harder to do business here right now.
Estimates suggest that the UK's departure is costing the UK economy about £100 billion every year, and that its economy is 4% smaller than it would have been if it had stayed in the EU. In addition to making trade harder, it's also causing staffing shortages.
We have people that were ready to work that have now left the country, run home, whatever. That demographic is non-existent because of Brexit.
Buying luxury items here is now about 20% higher than it used to be for international visitors, meaning London is losing its status as a luxury destination. Investment in both private and public sectors have been declining since the 1990s, meaning it's less likely to handle factors like Brexit or the pandemic. Amidst the political changes like the 3 prime ministers, the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, and Brexit, there have been massive train strikes which are causing havoc on transportation, and that impacts business.
I have to restructure my entire day. Also, my clients can't even get to the salon sometimes because they've also got to restructure. Some of my clients are coming down from uni. They can't come down because of national rail strikes.
The UK rail strikes are the largest instance of industrial action since 1989. The strikes are taking place as workers demand better wages to cope with inflation, but people cannot get to work.
That affects the business because it means whatever money I'm meant to make for that day, I'm not making it.
I tend to plan my train rides around them a bit, but I'd absolutely support the strikers. I've got no problem with the strikers at all. If they need a strike, that's what they need to do.
So who's to blame here? Well, it kind of depends on who you ask.
Government mismanagement. I think the government's done a really poor job at managing it in the first place. And particularly when Liz Truss was in power, she did a really poor job with managing the government's kind of budget and affairs.
They demand the constant focus on capitalism in all capitalism models for every area of society is to blame as well. Not everything has to apply to a capitalist model, like housing, food, shelter, clothing, education, healthcare. They don't need to be inundated with the constant need to be profitable.
There's just infinite free money, essentially, for banks. So that's kind of like something went wrong on the scale of like 2008. Nobody seemed to notice because it just wasn't really spoken about. And then conveniently, Corona gave them an excuse to print infinite money.
They control the finances, they control the economy, they set the budgets, the taxes. Taxes are still being increased. As much as I didn't want to say it, I think it's the government at the end of the day.
While the UK population is slightly growing, about 0.33% each year, some people I meet say they're thinking of leaving.
So I met an entrepreneur who's paying over 50% in taxes, and now he's thinking about moving to the UAE to register his company there to avoid those taxes. And he's also looking at Portugal. Maybe he should live in Portugal where the cost of living is so much less.
A few have left, especially people that have younger children. Back home, they feel like they are not going to get a good quality of life here anymore, so they've gone to restart elsewhere.
I can imagine people leaving if they have that opportunity to. A lot of uncertainty around it, I'd say.
Some have left to other countries for work or like business opportunities, things like this, family life as well. It's affected a lot of people in lots of different ways.
But what happens next?
For as long as this government's in charge, it's just going to get worse and worse. They're in panic mode.
Inflation is slowly coming down, but it's still going to have long-term effects.
The government is very well hiding the recession, and it's been for a while now.
If we pay our taxes, they should come back to